May 1274 BCE. The pre-dawn darkness over the Orontes River valley was broken by the glow of 10,000 campfires. Pharaoh Ramesses II, 25 years old and burning with ambition to exceed the glory of his ancestors, stood outside his campaign tent watching his army prepare for what he believed would be a routine march to secure Egyptian dominance over the Levant. He had no idea that within hours he would face the closest brush with death and disaster of his entire 66-year reign. 3 miles to the north, hidden beyond a forested ridge, the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world waited in absolute silence. King Muwatalli II of the Hittites, commanding forces from 19 allied kingdoms, had orchestrated the most sophisticated military deception in Bronze Age history. His scouts had fed false information to Egyptian patrols for weeks. His army had marched through the night to reach an impossible position, and now, as the sun rose over the ancient city of Kadesh, the stage was set for the first great clash of empires, a battle that would involve more men, more chariots, and more sophisticated tactics than any conflict before it. This is the story of how two superpowers collided in the Syrian wilderness, how Ramesses' arrogance nearly destroyed Egypt's military power, and how a 20-year-old piece of propaganda carved into temple walls would shape how we remember ancient warfare for over 3,000 years. But the real story, hidden in Hittite archives discovered in 1906, is far more complex and far more interesting than the Egyptian version suggests. The road to Kadesh began not with Ramesses but with his father, Seti IV, who had spent his reign systematically reclaiming Egyptian territories in Canaan and Syria that had been lost during the chaos following Akhenaten's religious revolution. By the time Ramesses took the throne in 1279 BCE, Egypt controlled a vast but fragile network of vassal states stretching from Nubia to southern Syria. The jewel of this network, the key to controlling the entire Levant, was the fortress city of Kadesh, perched on a strategic mound overlooking the Orontes River. Kadesh was worth fighting for because of geography. It sat at the intersection of major trade routes connecting Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean coast. Whoever controlled Kadesh controlled the flow of copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and luxury goods moving between the great powers. The city's location made it nearly impregnable, surrounded on 3 sides by the Orontes and its tributaries, approachable only from the south across open ground that left attackers exposed. Seti I had captured Kadesh briefly around 1295 BCE, but the city quickly reverted to Hittite control. For Ramesses, retaking Kadesh wasn't just strategic, it was personal. He needed a military triumph to establish his legitimacy and surpass his father's accomplishments. In his 4th regnal year, 1275 BCE, he launched a preliminary campaign into Syria that achieved limited success but emboldened him to attempt a decisive strike. The Hittite Empire that Ramesses faced was a sophisticated military power that had been perfecting the art of war for centuries. Unlike Egypt, which relied primarily on professional troops and Nubian auxiliaries, the Hittites commanded a coalition empire of subordinate kingdoms stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates. King Muwatalli II could call upon forces from Al-Zawa, Dardani, Massa, Carchemish, Aleppo, Ugarit, and a dozen other kingdoms, each contributing their finest warriors and chariot squadrons. The Hittite military system was fundamentally different from Egypt's. Where Egyptian armies were centrally organized and commanded, Hittite forces operated more like a NATO alliance, with each kingdom maintaining its own military traditions while coordinating through a sophisticated command structure. This made Hittite armies more flexible and resilient, capable of absorbing losses that would cripple a centralized force. In spring 1274 BCE, Ramesses assembled his invasion force at the border fortress of Chiaru in the eastern Nile Delta. The army was organized into 4 divisions, each named after a major Egyptian deity, and numbering approximately 5,000 men. The division of Amun, which Ramesses commanded personally, would lead the march. Following at intervals were the divisions of Ra, Ptah, and Seth. Each division included chariot squadrons, infantry armed with spears and shields, archers, and support elements. The Egyptian chariot, the elite arm of Ramesses' forces, was a marvel of Bronze Age engineering. Built from lightweight wood with leather suspension, each chariot carried 2 men, a driver and an archer, and was pulled by 2 horses bred specifically for speed and endurance. The Egyptian design prioritized mobility over armor, with open sides that allowed the archer to shoot in any direction but provided minimal protection. Each chariot cost roughly the equivalent of a middle-class house and required years of training to operate effectively in battle. The standard Egyptian archer carried a composite bow, a technological masterpiece made from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together to create extraordinary power. These bows could penetrate bronze armor at 50 yards and had an effective range of over 150 yards. Each archer carried a quiver of 30 to 40 arrows with bronze tips, carefully crafted by specialist armorers. The infantry were organized into companies of 200 men, each commanded by an officer who answered to the divisional commander. They carried wooden shields covered with leather, bronze-tipped spears, and short swords for close combat. Unlike later armies, Bronze Age infantry were primarily defensive forces, designed to hold ground and protect the flanks while chariots decided the battle. Ramesses' army also included significant numbers of Shurden mercenaries, sea peoples from the Mediterranean islands who fought as heavy infantry with distinctive horned helmets and round shields. These professional warriors provided close combat expertise that complemented the Egyptian conscripts. The march north took approximately a month, following the coastal route through Gaza, Jaffa, and Byblos, before turning inland toward Kadesh. This was the same route Egyptian armies had followed for centuries, a well-supplied corridor with friendly cities and reliable water sources, but it also meant the Hittites knew exactly where Ramesses was and when he would arrive. What Ramesses didn't know was that Muwatalli had been preparing for this invasion for over a year. Hittite intelligence, sophisticated beyond anything the Egyptians imagined, had tracked Egyptian preparations through a network of spies and diplomatic contacts. Muwatalli knew the size of Ramesses' army, its organization, and its probable route. He used this information to orchestrate a deception that would have impressed modern military planners. The Hittite king assembled his coalition force at Kadesh months before the Egyptian invasion. The army that gathered there was staggering in size. Modern estimates based on Hittite and Egyptian sources suggest Muwatalli commanded somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 soldiers, including the largest chariot force ever assembled in the ancient world, possibly 2,500 to 3,500 chariots compared to Ramesses' 2,000. The Hittite chariot was fundamentally different from its Egyptian counterpart. Heavier and sturdier, it carried 3 men, a driver, a warrior with a spear, and a shield-bearer who protected both. This crew configuration made Hittite chariots more effective in close combat but slower and less maneuverable than Egyptian designs. The debate over which design was superior has occupied military historians for decades, but Kadesh would test both concepts under the worst possible conditions. Muwatalli's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He would conceal his massive army behind Kadesh, out of sight from Egyptian scouts approaching from the south. He would then send false intelligence to Ramesses suggesting the Hittite army was far to the north, still gathering forces near Aleppo. When the Egyptian divisions marched past Kadesh in an extended column, confident they faced no immediate threat, Muwatalli would strike with overwhelming force against the center of the Egyptian line, cutting their army in half and destroying it piecemeal. To execute this deception, Muwatalli deployed Bedouin agents who posed as deserters from the Hittite army. These men, carefully coached in their story, would allow themselves to be captured by Egyptian scouts and interrogated. Under questioning, they would reveal that Muwatalli was afraid of facing Ramesses and had retreated northward, buying time to gather more forces. It was exactly what the young pharaoh wanted to hear. On the morning of the battle, day 1 actually, the division of Amun with Ramesses at its head reached a position about 6 miles south of Kadesh. Egyptian scouts had reported the city appeared lightly defended, and Muwatalli's supposed withdrawal seemed confirmed when 2 Bedouin men were captured near the Egyptian camp. Brought before Ramesses, they provided detailed information about Hittite movements, all of it false. They claimed the Hittite king was near Aleppo, over 100 miles to the north, afraid to face Egypt's might. Ramesses, eager to believe he had frightened his enemy into retreat, made a decision that nearly cost him everything. Rather than waiting for his full army to concentrate, he ordered the division of Amun to push forward rapidly and establish a camp northwest of Kadesh. From there, he could besiege the city at leisure, while the Hittites remained paralyzed by indecision far to the north. What happened next has been reconstructed from multiple sources: Egyptian temple inscriptions, the poem of Pentor celebrating Ramesses' heroism, the bulletin, an official military report, and most importantly Hittite archives, discovered at their capital Hattusa in modern Turkey. These sources don't always agree, but together they reveal what really happened on that May afternoon 398 years ago. The division of Amun, approximately 5,000 men and 500 chariots, established camp on the northwest side of Kadesh around noon. The position seemed strong, with good visibility and access to water. Camp followers began setting up Ramesses' command tent while soldiers prepared field fortifications. The division of Rhea was still marching north, strung out along the route and about an hour behind Amun. The divisions of Ptah and Seth were even further south, several hours away. The Egyptian army was spread across 8 miles of march route, exactly as Muwatalli had planned. Around 2 p.m, Egyptian scouts captured 2 more Hittite soldiers near the camp. But these men, unlike the earlier Bedouins, were genuine deserters, or perhaps prisoners of war being used as expendable messengers. Under harsh interrogation, possibly torture, they revealed the truth. The Hittite army wasn't near Aleppo. It was right here, hidden behind Kadesh, ready to attack. Ramesses, according to his own inscriptions, flew into a rage at his intelligence officers. How could you fail to discover the enemy was so close? But rage wouldn't save him now. Even as he processed this revelation, Muwatalli was launching his assault. The Hittite king had positioned his chariot force in a concealed assembly area northeast of Kadesh, using the city and surrounding terrain to hide their numbers from Egyptian scouts. When his observers reported the division of Rhea strung out in march formation and completely vulnerable, Muwatalli ordered the attack. Approximately 2,500 Hittite and allied chariots, the largest mobile striking force in Bronze Age history, swept around the eastern side of Kadesh in a massive column. Their target wasn't Ramesses' fortified camp, it was the division of Ra, caught completely by surprise in march formation, with no time to deploy for battle. What followed was a massacre. The Hittite chariots, each carrying 3 heavily armed warriors, smashed into the division of Rhea like a bronze tidal wave. Egyptian soldiers, strung out along the march route with no defensive formation, were simply run down. Chariots moving at 20 miles per hour struck infantry who had seconds to react. The 3-man Hittite chariot crews could sustain continuous close combat, with the spearman and shield-bearer fighting while the driver maintained control. Within minutes, the division of Rhea ceased to exist as an organized force. Survivors fled in every direction, many running toward the division of Amun's camp, bringing panic with them. The Hittite chariot force, having destroyed Ra division, wheeled northwest and charged directly at Ramesses' camp. The division of Amun, alerted by the sounds of battle and the arriving refugees, had minutes to prepare. Ramesses, according to his later inscriptions, found himself in a nightmare scenario. His camp was surrounded on 3 sides. The division of Rhea was destroyed. His other 2 divisions were hours away, and the largest chariot force in the world was bearing down on his position. What happened next became the centerpiece of Ramesses' propaganda for the rest of his reign. According to the poem of Pentor and temple inscriptions at Abu Simbel, Luxor, Karnak and the Ramesseum, the young pharaoh mounted his chariot, called upon the god Amun for strength, and personally led a heroic charge that broke the Hittite assault and saved his army. The inscriptions are dramatic. I found the mass of chariots in whose midst I was scattering them before me like chaff. Not one of them could fight me. Their hearts quaked with fear when they saw me. Their arms went limp, they could not shoot, they could not hold their spears. I made them plunge into the water like crocodiles. They fell on their faces. I killed them at my pleasure. It's stirring stuff, carved in hieroglyphs 6 feet high on temple walls that still stand today. For 3,000 years this version dominated our understanding of Kadesh. Ramesses the Great warrior, abandoned by his cowardly troops, single-handedly defeating the Hittite host through personal courage and divine favour. There's only one problem. The Hittite records tell a very different story. The tablets discovered at Hattusa don't describe a decisive Egyptian victory. They describe a battle that ended in stalemate, with both sides claiming success and neither achieving their objectives. More importantly, they reveal what really saved Ramesses that afternoon, not divine intervention, but the fortuitous arrival of an Egyptian force that appears nowhere in Ramesses' official accounts. This mysterious force, identified in Egyptian sources only as the Nearin, were probably an elite unit or possibly Canaanite auxiliaries who had taken a coastal route and arrived at Kadesh from the west just as the Hittite chariots overran the Egyptian camp, Their unexpected appearance from an impossible direction caught the Hittites completely by surprise. While Ramesses and his household troops fought desperately to hold the camp centre, the Nearin struck the Hittite flank, creating chaos in their formation. The Hittite chariots, having broken into the Egyptian camp, made a crucial mistake. Instead of maintaining formation and systematically destroying resistance, individual chariot crews began looting. Bronze Age battles were economic enterprises. Chariots, armour, weapons and captives all had enormous value. Hittite warriors, seeing Egyptian equipment and supplies, couldn't resist the temptation to grab what they could. This breakdown in discipline gave Ramesses the opening he needed, with the Nearin attacking from one direction and the pharaoh's household troops rallying around his personal standard. The Egyptians created enough resistance to prevent complete annihilation. The fighting devolved into a chaotic melee inside and around the camp, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. As afternoon turned to evening, the tactical situation shifted again. The division of Ptah, making a forced march when they heard the sounds of battle, arrived on the field from the south. Though exhausted from their rapid advance, their appearance changed the numerical balance. Muwatalli, watching from his command position near Kadesh, faced a decision. He still had significant infantry forces that hadn't engaged, but committing them risked a general engagement against an enemy now receiving reinforcements. The Hittite king made a choice that has puzzled historians ever since. He held back his infantry reserves. The question of why Muwatalli didn't commit his full force has generated scholarly debate for decades. Some argue he was concerned about security, worried that if his entire army was committed and defeated, Kadesh itself might fall. Others suggest he simply didn't believe his infantry could effectively engage in the chaotic combat around the Egyptian camp. The most likely explanation is that Bronze Age command and control simply broke down. With thousands of men fighting in close quarters, dust obscuring visibility, and no effective way to communicate orders, Muwatalli couldn't coordinate a decisive assault even if he wanted to. As darkness fell, both sides disengaged. The Egyptians, having survived annihilation by the narrowest margin, pulled back to reorganize. The Hittites, having failed to destroy Ramesses despite catching him in the worst possible position, withdrew to Kadesh. The battle was over, but the fighting wasn't finished. The next morning, Ramesses with his army now concentrated and organized for battle, deployed for a set-piece engagement. According to Egyptian sources, there was additional fighting in which Egyptian forces drove Hittite chariots back toward Kadesh. The details are vague, but what's clear is that neither side achieved a decisive victory. Ramesses couldn't take Kadesh. Muwatalli couldn't destroy the Egyptian army. By the third day, both sides had had enough. The casualty lists were staggering. Egyptian sources naturally claim minimal losses, but the destruction of the division of Ra alone must have cost thousands of lives. Hittite casualties were probably similar, with their chariot force having absorbed heavy losses in the chaotic fighting. More importantly, both armies were exhausted, low on supplies, and facing the prospect of a protracted siege or campaign neither could afford. What happened next reveals the true nature of Bronze Age great power politics. Rather than fight to mutual destruction, Ramesses and Muwatalli negotiated. Not a formal treaty, that would come years later, but a practical arrangement. The Egyptians would withdraw. The Hittites would maintain control of Kadesh. Both sides would claim victory. For Ramesses, this presented a challenge. He couldn't return to Egypt and admit he'd nearly been destroyed, lost an entire division, and failed to achieve his objective. Egyptian kingship was built on the concept of pharaoh as victorious warrior, the living embodiment of divine power. A defeat at Kadesh would undermine his legitimacy and invite challenges to his rule. So Ramesses did what any savvy politician would do. He lied magnificently. Within months of returning to Egypt, temples across the kingdom were being decorated with massive reliefs depicting Ramesses' heroic victory at Kadesh. The poem of Pentor, composed by court scribes, was inscribed on temple walls in language designed to be read aloud at public festivals. The bulletin, a more prosaic military report, provided supporting details. Together, these sources created a narrative of triumph that became official Egyptian history. The genius of Ramesses' propaganda was its detail. The inscriptions didn't just claim victory, they told a compelling story of courage against impossible odds. Ramesses abandoned by cowardly troops, calling upon Amun, personally fighting through masses of enemies, the god strengthening his arm and guiding his shots. It was dramatic, emotional, and completely believable to an Egyptian audience raised on tales of pharaonic omnipotence. The temples where these inscriptions appeared were themselves propaganda. Abu Simbel, carved into a Nubian cliff face, featured 4 massive statues of Ramesses, each 66 feet tall, flanking an entrance covered with Kadesh battle scenes. The Ramesseum, Ramesses' mortuary temple at Thebes, dedicated an entire wall to the battle. Karnak and Luxor temples received similar treatment. Every major religious site in Egypt became a billboard for Ramesses' version of events. The visual propaganda was sophisticated. The relief showed Ramesses larger than any other figure, a standard convention but used here to emphasize his dominance. Egyptian soldiers were depicted in organized ranks, while Hittite chariots tumbled in confusion. The city of Kadesh appeared surrounded by Egyptian forces. To an illiterate Egyptian, viewing these images, the message was clear. Ramesses had won a great victory, but here's what makes Ramesses' propaganda genuinely remarkable. He knew that at least some people, his own generals, survivors of the battle, foreign diplomats, knew the truth. The massive inscriptions included details that actually acknowledged the disaster, the surprise attack, the destruction of Ra division, the penetration of his camp. But these acknowledgements were framed as tests of Ramesses' courage, challenges overcome through personal heroism. By admitting the danger while claiming triumph, Ramesses created a narrative resistant to contradiction. Critics couldn't say he's lying about what happened, because he'd already admitted the situation was dire. They could only argue about the outcome, and who could contradict Pharaoh about that? For 3,000 years this propaganda worked, until 1906, when German archaeologist Hugo Winkler excavated the Hittite capital at Hattusa and discovered something extraordinary: the Hittite archives. Thousands of clay tablets, including diplomatic correspondence, military reports, and crucially, a letter from Muwatalli to Ramesses discussing Kadesh. The Hittite version was very different. The tablets described a battle in which Hittite forces attacked the Egyptian army, inflicted heavy casualties, and maintained control of Kadesh. There was no mention of an Egyptian victory, no acknowledgement of defeat, just a straightforward account of tactical success that achieved the strategic objective of holding Kadesh. Even more revealing was what came after. If Ramesses had truly won a great victory, Egypt should have dominated Syria in the following years. Instead, the opposite happened. Egyptian influence in the region declined. Vassal states switched allegiance to the Hittites, and Ramesses, rather than pressing his advantage, spent the next 15 years trying to rebuild Egyptian power in Canaan. The final proof came in 1259 BCE, 15 years after Kadesh. Ramesses and the new Hittite king Hattusili III concluded a formal peace treaty, the oldest surviving international treaty in history. Copies were inscribed in both Egyptian and Hittite, and remarkably, both versions survive, allowing us to compare them. The treaty established a border that left Kadesh and most of Syria in Hittite hands. It created a defensive alliance against common enemies, and it included provisions for extradition of refugees and mutual assistance. In other words, it was a treaty between equals, not a dictate from a victor to the vanquished. The treaty's language is revealing. It speaks of the great king of Egypt and the great king of Hatti as brothers, a diplomatic formula indicating equal status. If Ramesses had truly crushed the Hittites at Kadesh, this phrasing would be incomprehensible. Victors don't negotiate as equals with defeated enemies. The real outcome of Kadesh was stalemate. Both empires had tested each other's strength and found their opponent formidable, enough that continued warfare served no purpose. The battle demonstrated that neither power could achieve decisive victory without unacceptable cost, so they negotiated a practical peace that lasted the rest of Ramesses' reign and beyond. But why does any of this matter? Why should we care about a Bronze Age battle fought over a city that barely exists today? Because Kadesh reveals fundamental truths about power, propaganda, and how history is constructed. Ramesses' propaganda was so effective that for 3,000 years, historians accepted his version of events. It appeared in textbooks, popular histories, and academic studies as established fact. The discovery of contrary evidence forced a complete reassessment not just of this battle, but of how we evaluate ancient sources. The battle itself demonstrated several important military principles that remain relevant. First, intelligence matters. Muwatalli's deception operation nearly destroyed the Egyptian army. Ramesses' failure to verify intelligence reports almost cost him his life. Second, logistics and organization matter. The Egyptian army's extended march formation, while standard practice, created vulnerability that a sophisticated enemy exploited. Third, training and leadership matter. The Egyptian army, caught in the worst possible situation, didn't collapse completely. Enough units maintained cohesion to prevent total disaster. Kadesh also marked a turning point in ancient warfare. It was probably the largest chariot battle in history, and it demonstrated both the potential and limitations of chariot warfare. The Hittite chariot charge was devastating against unprepared infantry, but became uncontrollable in close combat. Egyptian chariots were effective as mobile firing platforms, but vulnerable to coordinated assault. Within a few centuries, both empires would transition away from chariot-focused armies toward combined arms forces emphasizing infantry. The battle occurred at a crucial moment in Bronze Age history. The great powers of the ancient Near East, Egypt, Hatti, Assyria, Babylon, were entering a period of unprecedented interconnection. Trade networks spanned from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean. Diplomatic correspondence was conducted in Akkadian, the international language of the era. Royal families intermarried across borders. It was in many ways the first globalized world system. Kadesh threatened to disrupt this system. An Egyptian conquest of Syria would have upset the balance of power and potentially triggered wider conflict. The stalemate and subsequent treaty preserved the peace and allowed the Bronze Age world system to flourish for another generation. That flourishing ended catastrophically around 1200 BCE when the entire Bronze Age civilization collapsed. The Sea Peoples, still not fully understood, swept across the eastern Mediterranean, destroying cities and toppling kingdoms. The Hittite Empire disappeared completely. Egypt survived but was severely weakened. The carefully constructed international order shattered. In this context, the peace treaty between Ramesses and Hattusili takes on additional significance. It represents the last major diplomatic achievement of the Bronze Age world system, a final attempt by great powers to manage their conflicts through negotiation rather than warfare. Within a generation of the treaty, that option would no longer exist. The human cost of Kadesh is impossible to calculate precisely. Thousands of men died in the initial Hittite assault and the subsequent fighting. Many more were wounded, some fatally in the days following the battle. Bronze Age armies didn't have medical corps. Serious wounds meant death from infection or blood loss. The psychological impact on survivors must have been severe. For Egyptian soldiers who experienced the Hittite chariot charge, the memory would have been traumatic. The sound of thousands of hooves, the dust clouds, the mass of bronze bearing down on your position, these images would haunt survivors for life. Hittite casualties are less documented, but the chaotic fighting around the Egyptian camp and the second day's battle would have produced similar losses. The chariot crews who penetrated the camp and became disorganized were particularly vulnerable. Bronze armor provided some protection, but at close range, bronze weapons could penetrate it. One detail from Egyptian inscriptions is particularly haunting. The reliefs at Karnak show Egyptian soldiers cutting the hands off dead Hittites to present to Ramesses as proof of kills. This wasn't artistic license. Bronze Age armies routinely mutilated enemy dead for body counts. The practice serves as a grim reminder of warfare's brutality across all eras. The economic impact was also significant. Each chariot destroyed represented enormous resource investment. The horses alone were valuable, requiring years of breeding and training. A single lost chariot with its team and crew might represent the annual tax revenue of a small village. Thousands of chariots were damaged or destroyed at Kadesh, representing a massive loss of military capital for both sides. Egypt's economy could absorb these losses better than most kingdoms, thanks to the Nile's agricultural productivity. But even Egypt felt the strain. Ramesses' building projects, already ambitious, required enormous resources. Adding military reconstruction to this burden stretched even Egypt's capacity. The Hittite Empire, more dependent on tribute from subject kingdoms, faced similar challenges. Rebuilding the chariot force meant demanding more from vassals who might already be questioning their loyalty after failing to achieve decisive victory at Kadesh. The battle influenced military thinking for generations. Egyptian tactical manuals from later periods, preserved on papyrus, reference Kadesh as a cautionary tale about reconnaissance and march security. Don't do what Ramesses did became implicit military doctrine, Interestingly, Ramesses himself seems to have learned from the experience. His later military campaigns, particularly in Nubia and Libya, showed much more careful planning and reconnaissance. He never again allowed his army to be caught in an extended march formation, within striking distance of a major enemy force. The propaganda, however, never acknowledged any lessons learned. That would have required admitting error, and pharaohs didn't make errors. Instead, the temple inscriptions consistently portrayed Kadesh as a triumph from which nothing need be learned except admiration for Ramesses' heroism. This disconnect between public narrative and private reality is fascinating. Ramesses the man clearly understood what went wrong at Kadesh. His subsequent military conduct proved he'd learned from the experience, but Ramesses the king, the living god, the symbol of Egyptian power, couldn't acknowledge mistakes. So two versions of Ramesses existed, the actual person who learned and adapted, and the public persona carved in stone as eternally victorious. The Treaty of 1259 BCE formalized this duality. Its existence proved Kadesh hadn't been the victory Egypt claimed, but its language carefully avoided any admission of this. Both sides agreed to peace and alliance without acknowledging that neither had won. It was diplomatic face-saving on a massive scale. The treaty's implementation required significant concessions from Egypt. Several cities and territories claimed by Ramesses were acknowledged as Hittite possessions. Egyptian influence in Syria was effectively abandoned. The border was fixed at roughly the limits of Egyptian control before the Kadesh campaign. In practical terms, Egypt gained nothing from the war except avoiding further losses. But the treaty wasn't a defeat document. It was genuinely a partnership agreement between equal powers. The mutual defense clauses meant something. When Hattusili faced a succession crisis, Egyptian support helped stabilize his position. When Egypt faced Libyan incursions, Hittite diplomatic pressure on mutual neighbors helped isolate the threat. The treaty worked because both sides needed it to work. The cost of continued warfare exceeded any plausible benefit. Both empires faced other threats. Sea peoples' migrations were already beginning, economic pressures were mounting, internal dissent needed managing. Peace with each other allowed both powers to focus resources elsewhere. There's a poignant coda to the treaty. Hattusili's daughter was sent to Egypt to marry Ramesses, sealing the alliance through royal marriage. Egyptian records describe her arrival with great ceremony, welcomed as a great queen despite being a foreigner. Her Hittite name, whatever it was changed to the Egyptian Pharaoh. She disappears from records after this, one of many royal women whose lives were diplomatic tools. We don't know if she was happy in Egypt, whether she ever saw her family again, whether she understood her role in ending the conflict that Kadesh had begun. Her father sent her with an enormous dowry and an escort of Hittite nobles. The message was clear. This alliance was serious, backed by the highest levels of both governments. The marriage produced no children that we know of. Ramesses already had numerous offspring from multiple wives. Pharaoh was probably in her teens, Ramesses in his 60s. The union was symbolic, not reproductive, but symbols mattered. The sight of a Hittite princess in the Egyptian court, honoured and respected, communicated the new reality more effectively than any treaty language. Enemies had become allies. The war was truly over. Ramesses lived another 33 years after the treaty, dying around 1213 BCE at approximately 90 years old. His reign of 66 years is one of the longest in Egyptian history. He spent those decades building monuments, temples, statues and inscriptions that still dominate Egypt's ancient landscape. Nearly every major temple in Egypt has additions or modifications from Ramesses' reign. The Kadesh battle scenes remained prominent in all of them. Even in old age, Ramesses never stopped promoting his version of that battle. The massive reliefs were repainted and maintained. New temples received Kadesh inscriptions. The story was incorporated into royal festivals and ceremonies. To the end of his reign and beyond, Ramesses II was the pharaoh who defeated the Hittites at Kadesh. The truth died with the generation that fought there. When Muwatalli died around 1272 BCE, just 2 years after Kadesh, he was succeeded by his son Ur-Hiteshub, who reigned only 7 years before being overthrown by his uncle Hattusili. These Hittite succession struggles weakened the empire's stability, and probably made Hattusili more inclined to negotiate seriously with Egypt. By the time of the formal treaty in 1259 BCE, only the oldest veterans remembered Kadesh clearly. For everyone else, it was history, and history is shaped by those who write it down. Ramesses wrote it in stone, literally, ensuring his version would outlast any Hittite counter-narrative. When the Hittite Empire collapsed around 1180 BCE, destroyed by invasions and internal revolt, their archives were buried and forgotten. Egypt survived, diminished but intact, and Ramesses' monuments remained. For the next 3,000 years, Kadesh was an Egyptian victory because Egypt's version was the only one anyone could read. The rediscovery of the Hittite archives in the early 20th century was revolutionary for ancient history. Suddenly, we could compare accounts, check claims, verify narratives. The Egyptian version of Kadesh fell apart under this scrutiny. Not completely, the basic facts remained, but the interpretation changed fundamentally. Modern historians now describe Kadesh as a tactical Hittite victory. They achieved their battle objectives that resulted in a strategic stalemate. Neither side achieved their war aims that led to a negotiated peace between equals. It's a much more complex and interesting story than Ramesses' version, but it lacks the dramatic simplicity of a hero's triumph. The archaeological evidence from Kadesh itself is limited. The site has been excavated multiple times, but battle debris is surprisingly scarce. Bronze weapons and equipment were too valuable to leave on the battlefield. Bodies were buried or burned. The landscape has changed over 3,000 years. We can identify the general location where the battle occurred, but precise tactical details remain unclear. What we can see is the city Ramesses fought to capture. Kadesh was formidable. Its walls were thick, its position nearly impregnable. The city's strategic value was obvious from its location. Controlling Kadesh meant controlling movement between the coast and interior, between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. No wonder both empires considered it worth a massive battle. The city continued under Hittite control after Kadesh until the Bronze Age collapse. Then it was destroyed, probably by the Sea Peoples or during the general chaos of that period. It was never rebuilt on the same scale. By the Iron Age, Kadesh was a minor settlement. Today it's an archaeological site called Tel Nebi Mend in western Syria, occasionally excavated when regional stability permits. The modern Middle East has made Kadesh relevant again in unexpected ways. The battle took place in what's now Syria, near the Lebanese border, in a region that's seen continuous conflict for generations. When scholars discuss Bronze Age battles fought over strategic control of the Levant, the parallels to modern conflicts are impossible to ignore. Geography still matters. The routes that made Kadesh valuable in 1274 BCE are still strategically important. The same basic tensions between regional powers, outside empires, and local populations continue. Technology has changed warfare completely, but the fundamental dynamics of power and conflict remain recognizable. There's something deeply human about Kadesh. Two young kings, Ramesses was 25, Muwatalli probably similar, both trying to prove themselves, both commanding forces beyond their experience, collided in a battle neither fully understood. Thousands died because of their ambitions and mistakes. Then both sides lied about what happened, protecting their reputations while quietly negotiating the peace their egos wouldn't let them publicly admit they needed. The aftermath of Kadesh reveals how propaganda shapes not just contemporary opinion, but historical understanding across millennia. Ramesses created one of history's most successful disinformation campaigns, not through crude fabrication, but through sophisticated narrative control. He acknowledged difficulties while claiming triumph, admitted danger while asserting dominance, described chaos while projecting control. The result was a story resilient enough to survive 3,000 years of scrutiny. The military lessons of Kadesh extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. The battle demonstrated that Bronze Age warfare had reached a level of sophistication that rivaled later eras in planning and deception. Muwatalli's intelligence operation, using false deserters to plant disinformation, showed an understanding of psychological warfare that wouldn't seem out of place in modern conflicts. His positioning of forces to exploit Egyptian march formation revealed sophisticated grasp of terrain and timing. The Egyptian failure was fundamentally one of overconfidence. Ramesses believed his own propaganda before it was even created. He saw himself as the living incarnation of divine power, destined for victory. This mindset made him vulnerable to intelligence that confirmed his assumptions. When Bedouin scouts told him the Hittites were fleeing northward, he believed it because it matched his expectation. Critical analysis of intelligence requires humility, the willingness to question your assumptions. Ramesses lacked this quality, nearly fatally. The role of the Naarine in saving the Egyptian army raises fascinating questions that remain unresolved. These mysterious troops appeared at exactly the right moment from an unexpected direction and changed the battle's outcome. Egyptian sources barely mention them, probably because acknowledging that anyone but Ramesses saved the day would undermine the heroic narrative. But their existence and actions are confirmed in enough sources that we know they were real and crucial. Who were they? The most common interpretation is that they were an elite unit, possibly Canaanite auxiliaries or specialized Egyptian troops, who had taken a coastal route to Kadesh separate from the main army. This would explain their arrival from the west and their absence from Ramesses' main force. Some scholars suggest they might have been an advance guard sent ahead to scout the area who returned at the critical moment. Others propose they were local allies, forces from Egyptian-controlled cities in the region who responded to news of the battle. What we know for certain is that their arrival was fortuitous rather than planned. If Ramesses had intended them to strike the Hittite flank as part of a coordinated battle plan, his inscriptions would certainly mention this brilliant tactical arrangement. The fact that they barely appear in official accounts suggests their arrival was unexpected, a stroke of luck that Ramesses couldn't fully claim credit for and therefore chose to minimize. The chaos of the battle itself is hard to overstate. Modern reconstructions, based on combining all available sources, suggest that fighting around the Egyptian camp lasted several hours. Thousands of chariots and tens of thousands of infantry were engaged in close combat across an area of perhaps 2 square miles. The noise alone would have been overwhelming. Thousands of men shouting, horses screaming, bronze weapons clashing, wooden chariots splintering. Communication in such conditions was nearly impossible. Officers couldn't coordinate units beyond immediate visual range. Orders were relayed by runners or trumpet signals that might be misunderstood in the chaos. Once formations broke down, combat devolved into thousands of individual fights. Survival depended on small unit cohesion, groups of soldiers staying together and protecting each other. The Egyptian household troops around Ramesses, his personal guard and elite chariot squadrons, were probably the best trained forces in either army. These men had trained together for years, knew each other's capabilities, and were fanatically loyal to the pharaoh. When the Hittite chariots penetrated the camp, these troops formed a defensive core that absorbed attack after attack without breaking. Their performance probably did save Ramesses, even if the broader Egyptian army needed the Naarine to survive. The Hittite charioteers who broke into the camp faced a terrible dilemma. They had achieved tactical surprise and initial success, but they were now fighting inside an enemy fortification against desperate defenders. The 3-man Hittite chariot crews, so effective in open-field combat, found their advantage reduced in the cramped conditions of a military camp. Chariots need space to maneuver. In tight quarters between tents and equipment, their mobility was compromised. This probably explains why some Hittite warriors dismounted to loot. With their chariots unable to move effectively, they abandoned their primary weapon system to grab valuable items. Bronze Age soldiers weren't paid regular wages. They fought partly for plunder, and an enemy camp was full of valuable equipment. But this breakdown in discipline was catastrophic. Warriors scattered across the camp, focused on looting, couldn't respond effectively when the Naarine attacked, or when Egyptian resistance stiffened. The fighting probably included horrific close combat. Bronze swords and spears are brutally effective weapons. Unlike later steel blades, bronze weapons were designed primarily for stabbing rather than slashing. A bronze sword thrust could penetrate leather or linen armor and cause terrible wounds. Fighting at close quarters meant blood, screaming, the smell of death. Ancient warfare was intimate and personal, in ways modern combat rarely is. The wounded faced grim prospects. Bronze Age medicine had no concept of antisepsis or infection control. Serious wounds typically meant death from infection within days, even if the immediate injury wasn't fatal. Soldiers who survived the battle with major wounds often died afterward, their fates unrecorded in casualty lists. The true death toll from Kadesh probably exceeded immediate battle deaths by a significant margin once we account for men who died of wounds in the days and weeks following. Both armies would have faced logistical crises after the battle. Feeding tens of thousands of soldiers required enormous supplies, and the fighting had disrupted supply chains. Wounded men needed care, depleting medical resources. Broken equipment needed repair or replacement. Horses killed or injured in combat needed replacing. No small task given the years required to train war horses. Both commanders faced hard decisions about whether to continue operations or withdraw. Ramesses' decision to stay and fight a second engagement the following day showed either courage or stubborn refusal to admit defeat, probably both. Deploying his now concentrated army for a set-piece battle was tactically sound. It negated the Hittite advantage of surprise and positioned Egyptian forces to use their strengths. But it was also a gamble. If the second day's fighting had gone badly, the Egyptian army might have been destroyed far from home with catastrophic consequences for Egypt's security. Muwatalli's decision not to accept battle the second day has been criticised by some historians as overly cautious. With the Egyptian army bloodied and disorganised, why not press the advantage? But Muwatalli had achieved his strategic objective, holding Kadesh. He had inflicted severe casualties on the Egyptians. Risking his entire army in a second major engagement might have resulted in Pyrrhic victory, winning the battle, but losing so many men that Hittite power in Syria became untenable. The decision to negotiate rather than continue fighting showed strategic maturity from both leaders. Neither could achieve decisive victory without unacceptable cost. Continuing the war would drain both empires without resolving the fundamental power balance. A negotiated peace, even without formal treaty terms immediately, allowed both sides to claim success and withdraw without losing face. The withdrawal of the Egyptian army must have been tense. Moving a bloodied army through potentially hostile territory, past the city you came to capture but failed to take, requires tremendous discipline. Egyptian soldiers knew they had suffered a severe blow. Maintaining morale and cohesion during the march home-tested leadership at every level. Ramesses used this march to begin crafting his narrative. The survivors were told they had witnessed their pharaoh's greatest triumph. The disaster was reframed as a test of divine favour that Ramesses had passed gloriously. By the time the army reached Egypt, the official version was already taking shape. Soldiers who contradicted this narrative would be questioning Pharaoh's word, an impossible position for anyone who valued their life. The creation of the Kadesh propaganda back in Egypt involved tremendous resources. Skilled stonemasons had to carve thousands of square feet of detailed reliefs. Scribes had to compose texts that would be copied across multiple temples. Artists had to design scenes that would be comprehensible to viewers who might be illiterate. The entire apparatus of Egyptian state propaganda was mobilized to turn defeat into victory. The poem of Ptah is particularly interesting as a literary work. Written in Middle Egyptian, it follows conventions of heroic poetry established centuries earlier. The language is elevated and formal, designed to emphasize Ramesses' divine nature and heroic qualities. Modern translations can't fully capture the original's impact, but even in English, the drama is evident. The poem was meant to be performed aloud at festivals, with the audience hearing Ramesses' triumph celebrated in language usually reserved for gods. The bulletin, by contrast, is more prosaic. It reads like a military report because that's essentially what it is, an official account designed for commanders and officials rather than public consumption. But even this supposedly factual document is shaped by propaganda needs. It acknowledges the surprise attack and danger, while emphasizing Egyptian resilience and eventual triumph. The bulletin's existence suggests Ramesses understood he needed to provide a detailed account that could withstand scrutiny from people who knew something about warfare. The visual propaganda at Abu Simbel deserves special attention. This temple, carved into a cliff face deep in Nubia, was designed to project Egyptian power to southern peoples. The 4 colossal statues of Ramesses dominating the entrance, each weighing hundreds of tons, communicated raw power before visitors even entered. Inside, the Kadesh battle scenes reinforced the message. Egypt, embodied in this divine pharaoh, was invincible. Resistance was futile. The temple's location was strategic. Nubia had been conquered by Egypt generations earlier, but maintaining control required constant displays of force. Abu Simbel reminded Nubians of Egyptian might, while also serving as a way station for expeditions further south. The Kadesh inscriptions told Nubians that even the mighty Hittites, whom Nubians knew only by reputation as the great power to the north, had been defeated by this pharaoh whose statues towered above them. Modern visitors to Abu Simbel see the relocated temple, moved in the 1960s to save it from flooding when the Aswan Dam was built. Even in its new location, the temple's impact is overwhelming. Standing before those 4 colossal statues, looking up at Ramesses' face 66 feet above, you understand how the propaganda worked. The scale alone communicated a message that transcended language or literacy. This is power. This is might. This is Egypt. The Kadesh inscriptions at Karnak Temple in Luxor are equally impressive. Karnak was Egypt's religious center, the primary temple complex dedicated to Amun, the god Ramesses credited with saving him at Kadesh. The battle scenes carved into Karnak's walls showed Ramesses calling on Amun and receiving divine aid. For Egyptians viewing these reliefs during religious festivals, the message was clear. The pharaoh and the gods were linked. Ramesses' victory was Amun's victory. Honoring one meant honoring both. The psychological sophistication of this propaganda is remarkable. By linking his personal triumph to divine favor, Ramesses made skepticism of his account into religious doubt. Questioning whether Ramesses really won at Kadesh meant questioning whether Amun really protected Egypt. For ordinary Egyptians, steeped in religious belief, this was an impossible position. The propaganda protected itself by making doubt into impiety. The economic cost of creating this propaganda was enormous. Carving reliefs into hard stone was expensive, requiring skilled craftsmen working for months or years. Pigments for painting the reliefs had to be imported or manufactured. The temples themselves were massive construction projects. Gold leaf for decorating statues and architecture was literally worth its weight. Egypt could afford this expenditure because of the Nile's agricultural productivity, but it still represented a significant drain on resources. Some historians argue that Ramesses' building program, including the Kadesh propaganda, was economically harmful to Egypt. The resources devoted to monumental construction might have been better spent on infrastructure, irrigation, or military modernization. The heavy taxation required to fund these projects may have weakened Egypt's economic base at precisely the time when new threats were emerging. Whether the propaganda was worth its cost depends on how you evaluate the value of ideological control versus material investment. What's undeniable is that the propaganda worked. For 3 millennia, Kadesh was remembered as Ramesses' triumph. The battle became synonymous with his name. Even after archaeologists began questioning the Egyptian narrative in the early 20th century, Ramesses the Great remained famous partly because of Kadesh. The battle that nearly destroyed him became the foundation of his historical reputation. The Hittite perspective on Kadesh, recovered from the archives at Hattusa, is frustratingly incomplete. We have diplomatic correspondence mentioning the battle, military reports, and administrative documents dealing with its aftermath. But we don't have a Hittite equivalent to the poem of Pentor, no detailed narrative from their viewpoint. This absence shapes our understanding fundamentally. We know what the Hittites did and achieved, but we don't know how they remembered or commemorated it. This asymmetry in sources has long plagued ancient history. Literate civilizations that preserved extensive records dominate our historical understanding, while equally sophisticated peoples who didn't write things down or whose archives were destroyed disappear from history. The Hittites are actually fortunate. Their cuneiform tablets survived because clay is durable. Peoples who wrote on papyrus or other perishable materials left far fewer records. The tablets from Hattusa reveal a complex bureaucratic empire that managed its far-flung territories through a sophisticated system of treaties, tribute, and client kings. The military dispatch system allowed communication across the empire in days. The diplomatic protocol was elaborate, with strict rules governing correspondence between great kings, lesser kings, and vassals. In this system, the Battle of Kadesh was just one event in an ongoing great power competition that had been underway for generations and would continue until both empires collapsed. From the Hittite perspective, Kadesh was a successful defensive operation. Egyptian forces had invaded Hittite-controlled territory with the goal of conquest. Hittite forces had stopped them, inflicted severe casualties, and maintained control of the strategic objective. By any reasonable metric, that's a victory. The fact that they couldn't destroy the Egyptian army entirely doesn't negate their success in achieving their war aims. The Hittite decision to eventually negotiate a formal treaty reflected practical calculation rather than weakness. With Sea People's migrations beginning to pressure the empire's western provinces, with Assyria growing stronger to the east, with internal succession disputes threatening stability, the Hittites needed peace with Egypt. The treaty wasn't surrender, it was recognition that the status quo served Hittite interests better than continued warfare. The treaty negotiations themselves must have been complex. Bronze Age diplomacy involved elaborate protocol and ritual. Letters between great kings followed strict formats. Gifts were exchanged to demonstrate wealth and power. Diplomatic marriages sealed alliances. The process of moving from battlefield enemies to treaty partners required both sides to save face while making real concessions. The language of the treaty is fascinating for what it reveals about international relations in the Bronze Age. The concept of equal great kings implied a world system where multiple powers coexisted under accepted rules. These rules included mutual recognition of borders, extradition of fugitives, and mutual defense. Breaking these rules damaged a king's reputation and could lead to diplomatic isolation. The system wasn't enforced by any higher authority, but it was maintained by mutual interest in stability. The extradition clauses in the treaty are particularly interesting. Both sides agreed to return refugees who fled from one empire to the other. This included political dissidents, criminals, and economic migrants. The clauses protected the interests of both governments, but ignored the interests of individuals caught between empires. A person fleeing Hittite territory for Egypt would be returned to face Hittite justice. This cooperation between empires and controlling population movement shows how Bronze Age states prioritized order over individual rights. The mutual defense provisions had real consequences. When Hattusili faced a challenge from his nephew Urhi-Teshub, the deposed king he had overthrown, Egyptian diplomatic support helped isolate the challenger. When Egypt faced Libyan incursions on its western border, Hittite pressure on intermediate powers reduced the threat. The Ptah alliance worked because both parties honoured their commitments. The marriage of Hattusili's daughter to Ramesses, which occurred several years after the treaty, was the ultimate seal on the alliance. Royal marriages were political tools, creating family ties between ruling houses that made conflict more difficult. The princess became a living symbol of peace, her presence in the Egyptian court a daily reminder of the alliance. Her children, if she had any, would have tied together Egyptian and Hittite royal bloodlines. The human dimension of this arranged marriage is poignant. A teenage girl, probably around 15 or 16 when she was sent to Egypt, left her homeland forever to marry a man in his 60s who already had multiple wives and dozens of children. She spoke a different language, worshipped different gods, and lived in a culture utterly foreign to everything she had known. Egyptian records describe her arrival as a joyous occasion with great celebration. But what did she feel? Did she weep for the home she'd never see again? Was she terrified of her new husband? Did she eventually find happiness or just resignation? We'll never know. She vanished into the Egyptian court, one of many royal women whose lives were sacrificed to political necessity. Her Hittite name was erased, replaced with an Egyptian one. Her identity was submerged in her role. She existed to embody the alliance, not to live her own life. This was normal in the Bronze Age. Royal women were diplomatic currency, their value measured by the alliances they secured rather than their individual happiness or achievements. The peace that followed the treaty lasted for the rest of Ramesses' reign and beyond. Trade between Egypt and the Hittite Empire flourished. Diplomatic correspondence became routine. The border established by the treaty remained stable. For a generation, the two great powers that had collided at Kadesh coexisted peacefully. This peace was the true outcome of that battle, not victory for either side, but recognition that cooperation served both better than conflict. The Bronze Age collapse that began around 1200 BCE destroyed this entire system. The Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders whose origins remain debated, swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Their attacks, combined with drought, famine, and internal rebellions, brought down civilization after civilization. The Hittite Empire disappeared, its cities burned and abandoned. Egypt survived but was severely weakened, losing its foreign territories and declining into political fragmentation. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse are still debated by historians. Climate change causing crop failures, invading peoples, systems collapse due to over-specialization, rebellion by lower classes against oppressive elites, all these factors probably contributed. What's clear is that the interconnected world system of the late Bronze Age was fragile. When multiple crises hit simultaneously, the system couldn't absorb the shocks. Empires that had lasted centuries collapsed within decades. Kadesh, in this context, was one of the last great battles of the Bronze Age world system. The armies that fought there, with their elaborate chariot forces and professional troops, represented the peak of Bronze Age military technology. Within 2 generations, this entire military system would be obsolete. The Iron Age that followed saw different warfare styles, with infantry becoming dominant and chariots declining to ceremonial roles. The battle's location in modern Syria adds contemporary relevance. The region where Ramesses and Muwatalli fought has seen continuous conflict for most of recorded history. The strategic importance of the Levant, positioned between major powers and controlling trade routes, has made it a perpetual battlefield. Modern conflicts in Syria, Lebanon, and Israel echo the same geopolitical dynamics that made Kadesh worth fighting for 300 years ago. Archaeologists working at Kadesh in the late 20th and early 21st centuries faced challenges that would have seemed familiar to Ramesses' army. Political instability in Syria has repeatedly interrupted excavations. The site has been damaged by modern conflict. Preservation efforts are complicated by lack of funding and security concerns. The ancient battlefield has become a modern one, preventing scholars from fully investigating the site where the great battle occurred. What excavations have revealed is a city that was already ancient when Ramesses attacked it. Kadesh was occupied for thousands of years before 1274 BCE, serving as a regional power centre for generations. The walls that Ramesses failed to breach were massive, constructed with sophisticated fortification techniques. The city's water access, critical for withstanding siege, was carefully engineered. Taking Kadesh by storm would have required enormous casualties, even if Ramesses had defeated the Hittite field army. This raises an interesting counterfactual. Suppose the Hittite ambush had failed and Ramesses had destroyed their army in open battle. Would he then have successfully besieged Kadesh? The answer is probably no. Ancient siege warfare was brutally difficult. Without the city choosing to surrender, taking it would require months of effort, enormous casualties, and sustained logistics that the Egyptian army probably couldn't maintain so far from home. Ramesses' war aims may have been unrealistic from the start, regardless of how the battle went. The strategic situation that led to Kadesh was fundamentally unresolvable by military means. Egypt wanted control of Syria for economic and security reasons. The Hittites needed to maintain their Syrian territories to preserve their empire's integrity. Neither side could compromise on this without appearing weak to their other vassals and enemies. War was probably inevitable, but no military outcome short of complete destruction of one empire could permanently resolve the underlying issues. The Treaty of 1259 BCE worked precisely because it recognized this reality. Instead of trying to decisively defeat each other, the two empires agreed to coexist. The border was established not where either side wanted it, but where their power naturally balanced. Kadesh remained Hittite because the Hittites could defend it more easily than Egypt could take and hold it. This practical arrangement preserved peace because it reflected the actual balance of power rather than either side's aspirations. Modern international relations could learn from this Bronze Age wisdom. Treaties that ignore power realities and try to impose solutions based on ideology or wishful thinking tend to fail. Agreements that acknowledge how power actually distributes itself and work within those constraints tend to last. The treaty between Ramesses and Hattusili lasted because both kings understood their limitations and worked within them. The human cost of Kadesh continues to resonate across millennia. Thousands of young men died in a single afternoon because two kings wanted control of a city. The soldiers had no voice in the decision to go to war. They fought because they were ordered to, died because their commanders had made mistakes, and were forgotten except as statistics in ancient inscriptions. Only the kings were remembered, and they were remembered for a battle one claimed to have won heroically and the other quietly acknowledged had achieved its purpose. The democratic notion that common people matter, that their lives have value beyond their utility to the state, would have been incomprehensible to Ramesses or Muwatalli. Soldiers existed to fight and die for pharaoh or king. Their suffering was irrelevant except insofar as it affected military capability. The inscriptions at Abu Simbel and Karnak show Ramesses larger than life, crushing enemies beneath his chariot wheels. The actual soldiers who did the fighting appear as tiny identical figures, interchangeable and disposable. This dehumanization of common soldiers was necessary for Bronze Age kingship to function. If rulers acknowledged that each soldier was a human being with inherent worth, commanding them to die by the thousands would become morally unbearable. By reducing soldiers to symbols and statistics, kings could order catastrophic battles without confronting the human cost. The propaganda served not just to glorify the king, but to obscure the suffering that created his glory. Yet individual stories occasionally break through. The Egyptian soldier who recorded his experience at Kadesh in a letter home, discovered on a pottery shard by archaeologists, described the terror of the Hittite attack and his relief at surviving. A Hittite charioteer's name appears in administrative documents recording compensation paid to his widow after he died at Kadesh. These fragments remind us that behind the monumental propaganda were actual human beings who experienced this battle as the most terrifying event of their lives. The horses that fought at Kadesh deserve mention too. Ancient warfare depended utterly on these animals. Each warhorse represented years of selective breeding and training. They had to be strong enough to pull chariots at full gallop, brave enough to charge into combat, and obedient enough to respond to commands in the chaos of battle. Hundreds or thousands of horses died at Kadesh, shot by arrows, struck by spears, or simply running until their hearts gave out. Bronze Age armies treated horses as valuable equipment, but they were living creatures who suffered and died just like the human soldiers. The environmental impact of Bronze Age warfare is rarely discussed, but was significant. An army of 20,000 men and thousands of horses marching through the landscape consumed enormous resources. Trees were cut for fuel and construction. Water sources were depleted. Fields were stripped of crops. The passage of armies left devastation that could take years to recover from. The battle itself, with hundreds of chariots churning across the battlefield, would have destroyed crops and vegetation across square miles. The long-term ecological impact of Bronze Age civilization, including its warfare, may have contributed to the system's collapse. Deforestation for shipbuilding, metal production, and agriculture reduced the landscape's capacity to support dense populations. Soil erosion decreased agricultural productivity. Climate change, possibly partly anthropogenic even in the Bronze Age, may have tipped the system into crisis. Kadesh was just one battle, but multiply its impact across centuries of warfare and you see how civilization could undermine its own foundations. The metallurgical implications of Kadesh are fascinating. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, required international trade networks because copper and tin deposits rarely occur together. The tin for Hittite bronze weapons probably came from Afghanistan, transported across thousands of miles through multiple intermediaries. The copper might have come from Cyprus, Anatolia, or the Sinai. Creating the weapons for just one chariot required mineral resources from multiple regions and the industrial capacity to smelt and forge metal with precision. The amount of bronze lost at Kadesh was economically significant. Each warrior's weapons and armour represented substantial metal value. Chariots included bronze fittings and reinforcements. The battlefield would have been scoured after fighting ended, with both sides recovering as much bronze as possible for reuse. But much would have been unrecoverable, buried, lost, or too damaged to salvage. This represented permanent loss of metal that would need to be replaced through mining, smelting and manufacturing, a process requiring months and enormous labour. The technology of Bronze Age warfare was approaching its limits by 1274 BCE. Chariots were expensive, complex machines that required specialised craftsmen to build and maintain. The composite, bows used by elite archers, took months to manufacture and years to master. Bronze armour and weapons required sophisticated metallurgy. Training professional soldiers was time-consuming and costly. The entire military system depended on surplus agricultural production to free up labour and resources for warfare. This was ultimately unsustainable. When the Bronze Age collapse disrupted trade networks and agricultural production, the elaborate military systems couldn't be maintained. Iron weapons, much cheaper to produce because iron ore is more common than copper and tin, enabled the creation of larger armies with less economic investment. The Iron Age kingdoms that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse used different military systems because the economic base couldn't support Bronze Age military complexity. Kadesh was therefore not just a battle between two empires, but a demonstration of a military system at its peak and on the verge of obsolescence. The mass chariot forces that fought there represented the ultimate expression of Bronze Age military technology. Within a century, this entire system would collapse. The battle was simultaneously the climax and the beginning of the end for Bronze Age warfare. The influence of Kadesh on later military thinking is difficult to trace precisely, but was probably significant. Egyptian military manuals and training texts referenced the battle for generations. The lessons about reconnaissance, march security, and maintaining unit cohesion would have been passed down through professional military ranks. When later Egyptian armies deployed for battle, they did so with Kadesh's lessons in mind, even if they didn't explicitly reference the battle. The diplomatic impact may have been even more important. The treaty between Egypt and the Hittites established a precedent for great power coexistence through negotiation rather than perpetual warfare. This model influenced later diplomatic practice in the ancient Near East. The concept of formalized peace treaties between equals, rather than surrender terms imposed by victors, became more common after Kadesh. The battle inadvertently advanced international law by demonstrating that negotiated peace could serve both parties better than continued conflict. The archaeological legacy of Kadesh continues to evolve. Modern remote sensing technology, including satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, has revealed features of the ancient battlefield invisible to traditional excavation. Analysis of soil chemistry can identify areas where mass burials occurred. Metallurgical analysis of bronze artifacts can determine their origin and manufacturing techniques. Each technological advance provides new insights into this ancient battle. The challenge facing archaeologists is access. The site's location in Syria has made systematic excavation impossible during periods of conflict. Looting and unofficial excavation have damaged untold artifacts. Climate change is affecting the site, with increased erosion threatening ancient remains. The race to study and preserve Kadesh before it's further damaged or destroyed adds urgency to archaeological work. Digital preservation offers one solution. Detailed 3D scanning and photogrammetry can create virtual records of the site that will survive even if the physical location is destroyed. Archaeologists working at Kadesh and similar sites increasingly focus on digital documentation, ensuring that knowledge survives regardless of what happens to the actual artifacts and structures. In a strange way, this mirrors Ramesses' own preservation strategy. He carved his version of Kadesh into stone to ensure it would outlast living memory. Modern archaeologists use digital technology to achieve the same goal. The ethical questions surrounding ancient warfare remain relevant. Was Ramesses justified in invading Hittite-controlled territory? Did Muwatalli have the right to rule over cities that might have preferred independence? What about the people of Kadesh itself, who had no say in which empire controlled them? These questions don't have clear answers, and Bronze Age peoples wouldn't have formulated them in these terms. But examining ancient imperialism helps us think critically about modern versions of the same dynamics. The propaganda aspect of Kadesh is particularly relevant today. We live in an age of sophisticated information warfare where governments and other actors routinely shape narratives to their advantage. Ramesses' propaganda campaign demonstrates that this is nothing new. What's different is the technology, not the underlying impulse to control how events are remembered and understood. The techniques Ramesses used, acknowledging difficulties while claiming triumph, emphasizing personal heroism, linking political success to moral righteousness, remain standard propaganda approaches. The discovery of contrary evidence in the Hittite archives reminds us why multiple sources and critical analysis matter. If we only had Egyptian sources, Kadesh would remain a great victory rather than a complex stalemate. This principle extends to all historical events. Single-source narratives are inherently suspect. Understanding requires multiple perspectives, even when those perspectives contradict each other. The tension between conflicting accounts often reveals more truth than any single account alone. The pedagogical value of Kadesh for teaching ancient history is enormous. The battle touches on virtually every aspect of Bronze Age civilization: military technology, diplomatic relations, trade networks, propaganda, archaeology, climate and environment, social structures. A student who understands Kadesh deeply has a framework for understanding the entire Late Bronze Age. This is why the battle continues to feature prominently in ancient history courses, despite being militarily indecisive. The counterfactuals are endlessly fascinating. What if Ramesses' scouts had discovered the Hittite, ambushed before it was sprung? What if the Nearin hadn't arrived when they did? What if Muwatalli had committed his infantry reserves? Any of these changes might have produced a decisive outcome rather than stalemate. And decisive outcomes have consequences. A destroyed Egyptian army might have emboldened Egypt's other enemies, leading to fragmentation of Egyptian power decades earlier. A crushed Hittite army might have triggered the empire's collapse a generation before it actually occurred. But history doesn't work through counterfactuals. What happened is what happened. The stalemate at Kadesh led to a negotiated peace that lasted a generation. That peace preserved both empires long enough for them to face the Bronze Age collapse from positions of relative strength. Whether this ultimately mattered, given that both civilizations were devastated anyway, is an open question. Perhaps the treaty just delayed the inevitable. Or perhaps it gave both civilizations time to prepare and respond to crises more effectively than they would have if they'd remained enemies. The memory of Kadesh faded over centuries as both civilizations declined. By the classical period, Greeks and Romans had vague awareness that Egypt and some northern empire had fought in Syria long ago, but details were lost. The Egyptian inscriptions remained visible, but fewer people could read hieroglyphics with each passing generation. By late antiquity, the battle was completely forgotten, except by people living near the ruins who might have preserved garbled oral traditions. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries brought Kadesh back to light. Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphics in 1822 made Egyptian inscriptions readable again for the first time in over a millennium. Scholars translating temple inscriptions discovered the Kadesh battle narrative and marvelled at Ramesses' heroism. The battle was incorporated into ancient history texts as a great Egyptian victory, exactly as Ramesses had intended when he commissioned the propaganda 3,000 years earlier. The discovery of the Hittite archives at Hattusa in 1906 was therefore revolutionary not just for what it revealed about the Hittites, but for how it forced reassessment of Egyptian history. Suddenly, Ramesses' claims could be checked against an independent source. The narrative of Egyptian triumph fell apart under scrutiny. This was uncomfortable for scholars who had built careers on the Egyptian narrative, but it was essential for historical accuracy. The process of revising historical understanding continues. New archaeological discoveries, improved dating techniques, better understanding of ancient languages all contribute to evolving interpretations of Kadesh. No interpretation is final. Future discoveries may force yet another reassessment. This is how history works, as an ongoing conversation between evidence and interpretation, constantly refined as new information emerges. Ramesses lived to old age, and died around 1213 BCE after ruling for 66 years. His mummy survives, moved multiple times in antiquity to protect it from tomb robbers, and now residing in the Cairo Museum. Modern forensic analysis has revealed details of his death, arthritis, hardened arteries, dental abscesses, and probable complications from old age. He was about 90 when he died, extraordinarily old for the Bronze Age. His longevity allowed him to see his propaganda succeed completely. By the time of his death, Kadesh was remembered throughout Egypt as his greatest triumph. Mission accomplished. His successors inherited an empire he had maintained but not expanded. The peace with the Hittites held, but both empires were weakening. Ramesses' building program, while creating magnificent monuments, had strained Egypt's economy. His numerous offspring created succession complications. Within 2 generations of his death, Egypt was fragmenting. The Bronze Age collapse was beginning, and Egypt, though it survived better than most civilizations, could not escape the general decline. The Hittite Empire collapsed completely around 1180 BCE. Their capital Hattusa was abandoned after being burned. The bureaucratic machinery that had governed a vast empire simply stopped functioning. Successor states emerged in parts of former Hittite territory, but the great empire was gone forever. When archaeologists excavated Hattusa over 3,000 years later, they found the archives that finally told the Hittite side of Kadesh's story. The city of Kadesh itself declined after the Bronze Age collapse, and was eventually abandoned. By the Iron Age, it was a minor settlement. In the classical period, it was barely remembered. Today, Tel Nebi Mend is a dusty archaeological mound in western Syria, visited by few people outside of archaeologists and local residents. The great fortress that 2 empires fought to control is reduced to eroded foundations and pottery sherds. Time has been more destructive than any army, yet the battle lives on, not in the physical landscape but in historical memory and scholarly debate. Kadesh has become a case study in how we construct historical narratives, how propaganda shapes understanding, and how new evidence forces us to revise established views. The battle itself, a brutal afternoon of violence that killed thousands, matters less than what it reveals about Bronze Age civilization, ancient warfare, and the nature of historical truth. The parallels between Ramesses' propaganda and modern information warfare are striking enough that military historians and intelligence analysts study Kadesh as an early example of strategic communication. The techniques Ramesses employed, controlling the narrative, emphasizing selected facts while omitting others, linking political objectives to higher values, remains standard practice in modern conflicts. Every war produces competing narratives, with each side claiming victory and justifying their actions. Kadesh reminds us this is ancient practice, not modern invention. The role of archaeology in revealing truth that contradicts official narratives has implications beyond ancient history. Authoritarian regimes throughout history have tried to control how events are remembered, creating official versions that serve state interests. Physical evidence, documents, artifacts, archaeological remains can contradict these official narratives and reveal what actually happened. The Hittite archives did this for Kadesh. Similar processes occur with more recent historical events, where evidence gradually undermines propaganda and reveals more complex truth. The educational challenge is teaching students to evaluate sources critically, recognizing that all sources have biases and serve purposes beyond simply recording facts. The Egyptian inscriptions aren't lies exactly. They're truth filtered through ideological requirements and political needs. Learning to read through this filtering, understanding what sources reveal by what they omit or emphasize as much as by what they explicitly state, is a crucial historical skill. Kadesh provides an ideal teaching example because we can compare sources directly. The preservation of ancient sites like Kadesh raises urgent questions about cultural heritage in conflict zones. Syria's civil war has devastated countless archaeological sites, with some deliberately destroyed and others damaged as collateral in fighting. International law protects cultural heritage, but enforcement is difficult when states are failing and armed groups operate outside legal frameworks. The knowledge we might have gained from proper excavation of Kadesh has been partially lost to modern conflict, ironically occurring in the same region where the ancient battle took place. Digital humanities approaches offer new ways to study Kadesh. Computer modeling can simulate the battle based on known parameters, testing hypotheses about tactics and outcomes. Database analysis of Egyptian and Hittite texts reveals patterns in language and thought, invisible to traditional close reading. Geographic information systems can analyze the terrain and reconstruct sightlines, approach routes, and tactical possibilities. These technologies don't replace traditional historical methods, but complement them, providing new insights that would be impossible to gain otherwise. The interdisciplinary nature of studying Kadesh demonstrates why narrow specialization is insufficient for understanding complex historical events. You need Egyptologists who can read hieroglyphics and understand Egyptian culture. You need Hittitologists who can work with cuneiform texts and Hittite political structures. You need military historians who understand tactics and operations. You need archaeologists who can interpret physical evidence. You need specialists in Bronze Age technology, climate, economics, and numerous other fields. Kadesh requires collaboration across disciplines, something that's increasingly important in modern scholarship. The gender dynamics of Kadesh and its aftermath are worth examining. The battle was an entirely male affair, fought by men, commanded by men, commemorated in inscriptions that focus exclusively on male actors. Women appear only as prizes or diplomatic tools, like the Hittite princess married to Ramesses. Yet women's labour supported the entire system. Women wove the linen for armour and clothing, processed the food that fed armies, raised the children who became soldiers, maintained households while men were at war. The battle depended utterly on women's work while erasing women from its narrative. This erasure is typical of how ancient sources treat women, and indeed how military history has traditionally treated women. Only recently have historians begun systematically examining women's roles in warfare and military societies. For Kadesh, we can ask questions like, how did the battle affect women in both empires? How many women were widowed? How did women cope with food shortages caused by military mobilization? What happened to women captives taken during the campaign? The sources don't answer these questions directly, but they're important for understanding the battle's full human impact. The economic analysis of Kadesh reveals staggering costs. Mobilizing 20,000 men for months meant that agricultural production fell. Those men weren't planting or harvesting crops. Their families needed support from the state. Equipment, weapons, armor, chariots, horses had to be manufactured, transported, and maintained. Food for men and animals had to be collected and shipped. The expedition consumed resources equivalent to perhaps years of normal tax revenue from entire provinces. And the return on this investment was nil. Egypt gained nothing concrete from the campaign despite its enormous cost. This raises fundamental questions about ancient imperialism. Why did states invest so heavily in wars that often produced minimal returns? Partly because ancient economies were zero-sum, wealth came from controlling territory and trade routes rather than from economic growth. Partly because military success was ideologically necessary for rulers to maintain legitimacy. Partly because the alternatives, allowing rivals to expand unchecked, seemed worse than the costs of warfare. But the economic rationality of ancient imperialism is questionable. Many military campaigns, including Kadesh, probably weakened the states that conducted them. The supply chain for ancient armies was remarkably sophisticated. Egyptian expeditions into Asia required supply depots pre-positioned along the route. Ships transported grain from Egypt to Levantine ports. Local vassal states were required to provide food and supplies to passing Egyptian forces. Fodder for thousands of horses had to be stockpiled at regular intervals. Water sources had to be secured and protected. The logistics of moving and sustaining an ancient army rivaled the complexity of the combat operations themselves. When supply systems failed, armies starved. Egyptian texts mention campaigns where soldiers ate their leather shield coverings because no food was available. Horses died of exhaustion or hunger, leaving chariots useless. Disease spread rapidly through armies suffering from malnutrition and poor sanitation. The unglamorous reality of ancient warfare was that more soldiers probably died from disease and supply failures than from enemy action. Kadesh's proximity to Egyptian-controlled territory helped, but the campaign still pushed logistics to their limits. The intelligence failure that nearly destroyed Ramesses at Kadesh has modern parallels. Throughout history, commanders have been defeated because they believed what they wanted to believe, rather than critically evaluating intelligence. The Bedouin deserters told Ramesses exactly what he hoped to hear, that the enemy was fleeing and victory would be easy. He accepted this without adequate verification because it confirmed his assumptions. This cognitive bias, confirmation bias, remains a major problem in military and intelligence analysis. Training analysts to question their assumptions and seek disconfirming evidence is difficult but essential. The tactical lessons of Kadesh remained relevant for centuries. The importance of reconnaissance, the danger of extended march formations, the need for reserves, the value of combined arms coordination. These principles appear in military manuals from every era. While specific technologies change, fundamental tactical dynamics remain surprisingly consistent. A Roman legion or a modern mechanized brigade would recognize the problems Ramesses faced, even if the solutions available to them would be different. The chariot as a weapon system reached its apogee at Kadesh and began its decline shortly thereafter. As infantry weapons and tactics improved, chariots became increasingly vulnerable. The cost of maintaining chariot forces kept rising, while their battlefield effectiveness stagnated or declined. By the Iron Age, cavalry, warriors fighting from horseback rather than from chariots, were replacing chariot forces in most armies. The transition was gradual, but Kadesh represents a high water mark. Never again would chariots dominate warfare as they did in the late Bronze Age. The cultural impact of Kadesh extended beyond Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Smaller states throughout the Near East watched anxiously as the great powers collided. Vassal cities had to calculate which side would win and adjust their loyalty accordingly. Miscalculation meant destruction. Kadesh could become you if you chose the wrong patron. The battle sent ripples throughout the regional system, affecting diplomatic calculations from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. Some vassal states played both sides, sending tribute to Egypt, while also maintaining relations with the Hittites, hedging their bets to survive regardless of who won. This was dangerous, but sometimes necessary for small states caught between empires. The letter archives from Ugarit, a coastal city that tried to maintain independence while surrounded by great powers, reveal the constant anxiety of being a pawn in conflicts between players who could destroy you casually. Kadesh reminded every small state of their vulnerability. The religious dimension of Kadesh shouldn't be overlooked. Ramesses' narrative emphasized that Amun had saved him, making the battle a religious as well as political triumph. This reinforced the Egyptian state religion and Ramesses' role as Amun's chosen representative. The massive temple-building program that followed Kadesh was partly about honoring the god who had granted victory. Religion and politics were inseparable in Bronze Age societies. A military campaign was simultaneously a religious act, with victories proving divine favor and defeats suggesting divine displeasure. The Hittites had their own religious interpretation. Hittite religious practice involved elaborate divination rituals before military campaigns, seeking the gods' guidance and favor. The decision to fight at Kadesh would have been accompanied by sacrifices, prayers, and consultation of omens. The successful defense of Kadesh confirmed to Hittites that their gods favored them and their king was ruling correctly. Both sides interpreted the same battle as divine vindication, demonstrating how religious belief can be compatible with contradictory outcomes. The long-term historical significance of Kadesh is that it established a framework for great power coexistence that lasted until the Bronze Age collapse. The battle was destructive enough to convince both sides that continued warfare served neither's interests. The treaty that eventually emerged created a stable international system that allowed trade and culture to flourish for a generation. This was arguably more important than any military outcome would have been. The battle's greatest legacy was the peace it ultimately produced. When we teach Kadesh today, we have choices about what to emphasize. Do we focus on the military aspects, the tactics and weapons and command decisions? Do we emphasize the propaganda and how it shaped historical memory? Do we examine the diplomatic outcomes and long-term consequences? Do we consider the human cost and ethical dimensions? All these approaches are valid, and a comprehensive understanding requires touching on all of them. The battle's richness as a historical subject allows it to support multiple pedagogical goals. For students of military history, Kadesh is a masterclass in how not to conduct operations. Ramesses' failures, overconfidence, inadequate reconnaissance, extended march formation, accepting unverified intelligence, are textbook examples of what military professionals are trained to avoid. Yet understanding why these mistakes happened requires empathy. Ramesses wasn't incompetent. He was young, ambitious, and operating within a worldview that emphasized pharaonic divinity and inevitable Egyptian supremacy. His mistakes were culturally conditioned, making them instructive for understanding how cultural assumptions can create strategic blindness. For students of propaganda and media, Kadesh demonstrates the power of controlled narratives and the difficulty of maintaining historical accuracy when official sources are systematically biased. The 3,000-year success of Ramesses' propaganda suggests that without contradictory evidence, official narratives become history by default. This has implications for how we evaluate contemporary events. What modern propaganda might future historians look back on with the same skepticism we now apply to Ramesses' inscriptions? For students of international relations, Kadesh illustrates how great power competition can be managed through recognition of mutual interests. The realist school of international relations would see the Egyptian-Hittite treaty as a classic balance of power arrangement, with both sides accepting limits to their ambitions based on practical calculations of what they could achieve and hold. The eventual peace suggests that rational actors can move past conflict when circumstances favor cooperation. This is cautiously optimistic about international relations, suggesting that warfare isn't inevitable if states can accurately assess their interests and limitations. The archaeological dimension of Kadesh provides lessons about how material evidence can challenge textual narratives. Archaeology isn't neutral. Archaeologists have their own biases and interpretations, but physical evidence has a stubborn materiality that resists complete manipulation. You can't easily propagandize pottery sherds or building foundations. They exist or they don't, and they tell stories that texts might omit. The combination of textual and archaeological evidence provides a more complete picture than either alone could offer. The ethical questions surrounding commemoration of warfare are highlighted by Kadesh. Should we celebrate military victories? If the battle was essentially a costly stalemate that achieved nothing lasting, what does it mean to commemorate it? Modern nations build monuments to wars and battles, often emphasizing heroism and sacrifice while minimizing cost and suffering. Ramesses' temples did the same thing. Are we still doing what he did? just with different technologies? How should societies remember their wars in ways that honour those who fought without glorifying violence? The comparison between ancient and modern warfare reveals both changes and continuities. Ancient soldiers fought with muscle-powered weapons at close range. Modern soldiers use precision-guided munitions from beyond visual range. Yet the fundamental experience of combat, fear, confusion, violence, death remains similar across millennia. Veterans of modern conflicts who read descriptions of Kadesh often recognise emotional experiences that transcend technological differences. This suggests something profound about the human dimension of warfare that persists despite changing technologies. The climate and environmental factors in Bronze Age warfare deserve more attention than they've traditionally received. Drought conditions affecting the eastern Mediterranean in the late 13th century BCE may have intensified competition for resources and contributed to the conflicts that led to Kadesh. Climate change was making agriculture more difficult, reducing the surplus available to support armies and administrative structures. The Bronze Age collapse that followed Kadesh by a generation was probably partly climate-driven. Understanding these environmental factors contextualizes the battle within broader forces affecting Bronze Age civilization. The role of animals in warfare, particularly horses, deserves more consideration. Horses weren't just equipment. They were sentient beings who experienced fear and pain, who formed relationships with their handlers, who suffered and died in battles they didn't choose. Bronze Age societies didn't conceptualize animal welfare as we do, but that doesn't mean we should ignore the animal cost of warfare. Thousands of horses died at Kadesh, adding to the battle's total suffering in ways ancient sources don't acknowledge. The public health implications of ancient warfare were severe. Armies were vectors for disease, moving through regions and spreading pathogens as they went. Wounds became infected. Poor sanitation in military camps caused dysentery and other illnesses. Traumatic injuries that modern medicine could treat were death sentences in the Bronze Age. The battle's casualty figures, if we had accurate ones, would need to include men who died days or weeks later from wounds or disease contracted during the campaign. The immediate death toll was probably just a fraction of total mortality caused by the campaign. The impact on non-combatants is largely invisible in our sources, but was surely significant. Armies marching through regions requisitioned food and supplies from civilian populations. Villages near the battle were probably looted by soldiers from both sides. Refugees fled combat zones, creating humanitarian crises in surrounding areas. Women and children who lost male providers faced poverty or starvation. These impacts don't appear in royal inscriptions, but they were real and devastating for those who experienced them. The question of military innovation at Kadesh is interesting. Neither side showed significant tactical creativity. Both employed standard Bronze Age formations and tactics. The Hittite ambush was well executed but conceptually simple. The Egyptian response was desperate improvisation rather than planned tactics. This suggests that Bronze Age warfare had reached a mature state where innovation was difficult. The technologies and tactics available were well understood and effectively optimized. Real breakthroughs would require new technologies, which came with iron weapons and new social organization in the subsequent Iron Age. The commemoration of Kadesh in Egyptian temple reliefs served multiple functions beyond propaganda. It was art, employing aesthetic principles to create visually compelling images. It was education, teaching illiterate Egyptians about their pharaohs' deeds through visual narrative. It was religion, honoring the gods who granted victory. It was politics, legitimizing Ramesses' rule through demonstrated military success. The reliefs were remarkably sophisticated multimedia propaganda, working on multiple levels simultaneously to communicate complex messages to diverse audiences. Modern preservation of these reliefs faces challenges. Air pollution, tourism, humidity, and simple aging threaten inscriptions that have survived for over 3,000 years. Conservation requires careful balance between access, allowing people to see these incredible monuments, and preservation protecting them from damage caused by visitors. Digital documentation ensures that even if the physical reliefs deteriorate, their content will be preserved, but there's something irreplaceable about standing before the actual carved stone that Ramesses commissioned, touching the same surface that ancient Egyptians touched. The debate over the battle's outcome, Egyptian victory, Hittite victory, or stalemate, continues among scholars. The evidence supports stalemate as the most accurate assessment, but reasonable historians can interpret sources differently. This ongoing scholarly debate is healthy, representing how historical understanding advances through argument and evidence. No single interpretation should be considered final. As new evidence emerges and new analytical frameworks are applied, our understanding of Kadesh will continue to evolve. What seems certain is that Kadesh was not the triumphant Egyptian victory that Ramesses proclaimed. The Egyptian army was caught by surprise, suffered severe casualties, failed to achieve its operational objectives, and eventually negotiated a treaty that left the disputed territories in Hittite hands. By any reasonable standard, this wasn't victory. Yet Ramesses' propaganda was so effective that for 3,000 years, most people who knew anything about the battle believed the Egyptian version. Only the discovery of independent sources finally revealed the truth. This suggests humility when evaluating historical events, especially when we have limited sources. How many other well-known historical facts rest on similarly questionable foundations? How many victories were actually defeats? How many heroes were actually failures? How many simple narratives hide complex realities? Kadesh teaches us to question, to seek multiple sources, to recognize that all accounts are constructed with purposes beyond simply recording truth. The final assessment of Kadesh must acknowledge its ambiguity. It was simultaneously a Hittite tactical victory, an Egyptian strategic failure, and ultimately a stalemate that led to lasting peace. It demonstrated both the sophisticated military capabilities of Bronze Age civilizations and the limitations of warfare as a tool for resolving disputes. It produced some of ancient history's most impressive propaganda, while also providing evidence for how that propaganda distorted truth. It was a disaster that nearly destroyed the Egyptian army, and a triumph that Ramesses celebrated for the rest of his life. Perhaps this ambiguity is appropriate. War itself is ambiguous, producing heroism and atrocity, victory and defeat, often simultaneously. The soldiers fighting at Kadesh experienced terror and courage, suffering and survival, death and life, all compressed into a few hours of violence. Their individual experiences couldn't be captured by either side's official narrative. The thousands who died there, Egyptian, Hittite, and allied soldiers from a dozen kingdoms, are reduced to archaeological remains and statistics. Their stories are lost, leaving only the king's propagandized accounts. We study Kadesh not because it was decisive, it wasn't, but because it illuminates. It shows us how Bronze Age civilizations functioned at their peak. It reveals the interplay of warfare, diplomacy, propaganda, and truth. It demonstrates how historical narratives are constructed and deconstructed. It reminds us that the past is both knowable and mysterious, simultaneously accessible through evidence and forever separated from us by time's gulf. Standing at Tel Nebi Men today, looking at the eroded mound where Kadesh once stood, you can almost imagine that May afternoon 33 centuries ago. The dust clouds raised by thousands of chariots, the sound of bronze weapons and screaming horses, the young pharaoh fighting desperately while his empire teetered on the edge of collapse, the Hittite king watching from his command post, ordering the attack that should have destroyed Egypt's army, but somehow didn't. The thousands of soldiers fighting and dying for causes they probably didn't fully understand. The thunder of that ancient battle has long since faded into silence. The warriors are dust, their weapons corroded away millennia ago, the empires they fought for collapsed and were forgotten. Yet through archaeology, through ancient texts, through scholarly analysis, we can still hear faint echoes of Kadesh. We can reconstruct what happened, understand why it mattered, and draw lessons that remain relevant today. Kadesh teaches us that power has limits, that propaganda shapes but cannot permanently obscure truth, that even the mightiest empires must eventually negotiate with rivals they cannot defeat. It shows us that warfare's outcomes are often ambiguous, that victory and defeat are sometimes indistinguishable, that the greatest battles can end without clear winners. It reminds us that history is written by victors, but can be rewritten by archaeologists armed with evidence and critical thinking. 3,300 years after bronze met blood on the plains of Syria, Kadesh endures, not as Ramesses intended, as proof of his divine favour and military genius, but as something more valuable, a window into how civilizations function, how truth gets constructed, and how we can use evidence to see past propaganda to complex reality. The battle Ramesses tried so hard to control, carving his version in imperishable stone ultimately escaped his control. The truth emerged despite his best efforts to contain it. That might be the ultimate lesson of Kadesh. Truth is patient. It can wait centuries or millennia. It can survive beneath desert sands while empires rise and fall above it. Eventually, if we look carefully enough, we can find it. The Great Battle of Kadesh, stripped of propaganda and viewed through multiple sources, reveals itself not as simple triumph or defeat, but as the complex, ambiguous, ultimately human event it actually was. That truth, purchased through generations of scholarship and archaeological effort, is more valuable than any propagandized version, however magnificently carved in stone.